What if bees weren't being so... I don't know where I'm going with this. Hello and welcome to What If Geography. Again, I'm always just trying to figure out different ways to introduce the podcast and get us rolling in new and unique and fun ways. And this one, probably more miss than hit, but you know, what's that famous Wayne Gretzky quote? You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So borrow from a completely different topic. Completely different.
What if all the bees died?
Yeah. So yes. So thanks, Hunter. So today's episode is exactly. What if all the bees died? What if there were just no more bees in the world, and sort of what that would do to our planet? But before we do that, let's just introduce the podcast as usual, just for all of our new listeners. Which we do get new listeners, I think, every time, because we always get a few more listens each time we release an episode. So this is the What If Geography podcast, where sort of, you know, me and Hunter are here, and we'll introduce ourselves in a second, sort of talk about these really big what if questions and talk about them in terms of geography and sort of what the impacts of whatever that scenario is would be on, you know, the world, or, you know, sometimes we get a little bit more localized. So, you know, what would be the impacts on the country, or, you know, that kind of thing. This is now episode, this would be episode 12, I think.
Nice.
Yeah. So we actually, as of the recording of this episode 11 is premiering tomorrow. That's on our Washington, D.C. statehood, which was a really fun episode.
So we're up to a dozen.
Yeah. And it should be a fun one, but, you know, let's go ahead and introduce ourselves, and Hunter, I'll kick it over to you because I've been talking for a little bit.
Okay, my name is Hunter Shobe. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I'm the author of Portlandness, a Cultural Atlas, and Upper Left Cities, an atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. And I'm glad to be back, co-hosting another episode.
Yeah, they're fun. And I am Jeff Gibson. I am a geographer as well, city planner as well, and I host the YouTube channel formerly known as What If Geography, but is now known as Geography by Jeff. And you can just generally go and, you know, watch a lot of the similar content on that YouTube channel that we sort of host here, except, and I've said this before, I love this podcast format because we just dive so much deeper. It's so much more, in my opinion, dynamic, where we can just sort of, you know, I mean, we can't talk endlessly. In fact, we're trying to get better.
We have a lot more time.
We have a lot more time. Yeah. So you can find me there. That's at youtube.com/at geography by Jeff. And again, I always make this clarification. I am a Geoff, Geoff. So you can find all of these inside the show notes, all these links to everything, which I'm going to start doing more regularly. So I guess with that, this will be a single parter. We are, I've said this a couple times now. A lot of our episodes have been two parters. We're trying to get better about doing single parters, just because I think they're a little bit more digestible. And I think we're trying to get them under an hour each time.
Let's see what happens.
It's a goal that we are constantly striving for. So we'll be trying that today. We'll see how well that goes. But I think with that, let's go ahead and launch into our topic today, of, you know, bees and sort of their impact on the planet, and sort of what they do and how they're important, and how they get wrapped up into, I think, and Hunter, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking this is going to tie a lot into the larger conversation of sort of climate change and all of that.
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons why bee populations are threatened, and climate change is one of them. So we'll get into some of these. One place we can start is so as I was doing research on this, I saw that Albert Einstein was often quoted famously for talking about bees, but famously misquoted. So I think most people are starting to introduce the quote as something he never said. And so there's not much evidence that Einstein ever said this, but, you know, when you you attribute something to Albert Einstein, then you grab people's attention, I guess. So,
do you know what the quote is? Can we?
Yeah,
the
quote he famously did not say is if the bee disappears from the surface of the earth, people, or man, he said, would have no more than 4 years to live.
Oh,
So
interesting.
that grabs people's attention, right? It's a
Yeah.
famous scientist talking about the fact that without bees, that people wouldn't be around much longer. And so this is a misquote. There's no evidence to say that he said this. The source seems to be a 1965 French publication, which attributed this to Einstein, and that was picked up and repeated over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
But some of what we'll talk about throughout the next hour is whether this idea that people can't live without bees is true or not, or to what degree that's true. So we'll lead up to that, and we'll get to talking about just what this does from the anthropocentric and from the people perspective without bees.
I think it's interesting, really quick, just because like Einstein, obviously one of the most well-known, prominent scientists of the modern era, but I wouldn't necessarily think he would. I mean, this is not taking anything away from him or his research, but like I would question his knowledge around bees in particular, because he was
not a biologist.
He's not a biologist, right? That's a very different kind of science, and you can't. One scientist isn't just a scientist for everything, right? They often specialize incredibly into one very small facet of various degrees. So all that's to say is I'm not surprised that that's not actually a quote from him. But I do understand, like, he is a big name, right? He's possibly the most well-known.
So listeners may have heard that, just to confirm that he probably didn't say it.
Yeah.
So there are about 20,000 species of bees in the world, and they are probably the most important insect pollinators, the most important pollinators that exist, and which is why they receive a lot of attention, because they're extremely important to people and to a lot of the foods that we eat. More than 4,000 species of bees are native to North America. So we'll talk globally a bit, and we'll situate this conversation partially in North America as well. That's where we're broadcasting from. A lot of these conversations about collapses of bee populations do hone in on the honeybee.
Mm-hmm.
Apis mellifera, I believe, is the pronunciation, the scientific name of the honeybee that originated in Eurasia and Africa, and was brought all over the world and is now found on every continent outside of Antarctica. Colonists brought the European honeybee to North America in the 1600s, primarily for honey as a source of sugar. So that's, going back a few hundred years, why the bee is here. And now it has become an extremely important pollinator for industrial agriculture.
Well, so that's interesting, because, okay, so we have bees everywhere. I mean, to varying degrees, places, which we're talking about. Right. Yeah. But it's interesting to hear that the current, most important pollinator for sort of our neck of the woods, North America, is these bees that are, I guess, for lack of a better sort of term, that it kind of sounds like they might even be more like invasive species, or at least a species that's not natural to here, right?
It's an exotic species. Some would call it an invasive species, because native population of bees have suffered, some would argue, at the hands of the honeybee in terms of the way that agriculture has developed over the last 100 years in particular.
Yeah. And it's interesting. The geography already is just, it's so fascinating how, like, and you said this happened when, like 1500, 1600, something like that?
Yeah, in the 1600s. So, I mean, already people in Mesoamerica, for example, kept stingless bees for a couple thousand years before Europeans showed up on the scene with the European honeybee. So if history had played out differently, there could have been ways to promote the proliferation of native bees, wild bees, instead of the honeybee, and we'd be having a slightly different conversation. Something that's distinct from many populations of wild bees as compared to the honeybees is the honeybee is a famously social animal. Right? They live in these colonies. They have very distinct roles. They operate out of hives. Wild bees tend to live independently of one another, and they don't have this sort of colony hive operation. They're not social in the way that honeybees are. With honeybees, we talk about drones, which are male bees whose only function socially is to fertilize the queen. There are worker bees, which are female bees, which are not capable of sexual reproduction. And these comprise most of the bee nest and social bee populations. And then there's the queen bee, which is the female that is sexually reproductive and in charge of replicating the hive colony.
And those are the
some
honeybees.
Of the terms that we use. What's that?
Those are the honeybees, the ones that.
Those are the honeybees. Yeah.
You're already blowing my mind. I did not realize that the native population of bees was not the, everybody loves sort of the honeybee kind of bee that we, have, that we kind of see every day. Or,
some people might have heard of mason bees. Right? These are generally native bees. Sometimes people put mason nests, or it's like a small wooden structure with individual holes that mason bees will return to or use for a year and operate out of. But it's a very different dynamic than honeybees. But a lot of what we're told about bees, I think many of us learn about bees are the honeybee. And that's different than wild bees. The other thing we should talk about is that there are other pollinators besides bees.
Yes.
These are the most important of these.
So what are these other pollinators? Let's
so the other pollinators are wasps, are some of them, and wasps,
not a fan of wasps.
I can understand, because they're hurts.
They're so mean.
By a wasp. Wasps belong to the same order of insects as bees, but are not bees. And apparently bees descended from wasps. Now, wasps are carnivorous. And at one point in history, some wasps start to adapt to live on nectar. And, this is what bees are looking for, honeybees. And so they change their diet, and they start to co-evolve with flowers. And we get a new insect called bees that is distinct from wasps. But wasps are also pollinators, butterflies, flies, ants, moths, beetles, hummingbirds, other bird species as well. And bats are also pollinators. And an interesting fun fact is that the agave plant, from which tequila is derived,
everybody's favorite liquor,
apparently exclusively pollinated by bats. So without bats, there would be no tequila. There'd be no agave.
So when we're talking about, I think when I'm thinking about a bee and like a pollinator, I'm thinking about, it's buzzing around some flowers, it's going into like sort of the, whatever the central part of the flower, getting sort of the pollen, whatever. And it's sort of like moving around. Is this the same general idea for all of these pollinators, or kind of doing the same thing? So like an ant's going to crawl into like a flower and
bring pollen from plant to plant. And then this is how flowers are replicated. Gotcha. Through the interaction of this plant and this animal. And so the creatures need each other in a lot of ways.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Thanks for the clarification. And then, we said wasps, we said butterflies, which are also, that's almost another topic unto itself, because they're also kind of disappearing. Bats,
ants, beetles, birds, particularly hummingbirds. So there are lots of different pollinators, but the reason why bees receive so much attention, there's a lot of different, species of bees that pollinate lots of different plants. And then in North America and many other places in the world, honeybees have been called upon by people to do a lot of pollination, and they've been kept in numbers that they wouldn't exist in normally, and spread throughout the world because people like the way that they can manage the bees and the way they can be used to pollinate. And so, I've found conflicting information on how long people have been keeping bees. It looks like that ancient Egyptians kept bees thousands of years ago. And if we go thousands of years before that, it looks like there's evidence for people keeping bees before agriculture even. So as a source of honey, probably. Then once people start practicing agriculture, just like 10, 12,000 years ago, depending on how, what estimates we're using, they start to become attractive to humans for another reason, which is that they can pollinate flowers.
So let's get into so I have a question for you.
Yes.
But before we do that, it's already time for a quick ad break.
Okay.
So time flies, right? So let's go ahead and do that, and then we will. And then I have a question for you after that. All right.
Very good.
Let's do it. Here's some ads. Welcome back. We were just finishing up talking about some of the different types of bees and sort of the pollination process. But I had a quick question for Hunter, who is obviously the primary host of this episode. So he has all the information, and I just get to pepper him with questions. Hunter, so what plants, and I think more specifically, what crops, right? Because that's probably most directly important for human beings. What crops do bees have an actual hand in pollinating?
All right, so this is a good question. There are, of course, many crops that are pollinated by bees, and there's different ways to sort of ascertain percentages. There is a article that gets cited a lot in bee research that was published in 2007 by Alexandra Maria Klein and 6 other colleagues. It's called The Importance of Pollinators in Changing Landscapes. And this was a global study that was done using primary data from 200 different countries. And it's talking about 115 of the leading global food crops. And of these, 87 are pollinated by animals, many of them by bees. And 28 crops do not rely on animal pollination. However, of those 28 crops, 60% of global production of food comes from them. So that even though it's a smaller number of, and I'll talk about some more specifics in a moment, there are a lot of, there are a smaller number of sort of the most grown crops that are not pollinated by bees or other insects, but they do make up the majority of the food that people eat. But let me give you some specifics here. And so foods that are dependent on bee pollination, and then some that are somewhat dependent on bee pollination. In other words, we've become dependent on them because we've used them for that. One of the crops apparently that would not exist without bees are almonds. Almonds are completely dependent, apparently completely dependent on bee pollination. There are other nuts, Brazil nuts, macadamia nuts as well, cranberries, cucumbers, cocoa. So, it would be tough to have chocolate without lots of bees. Kiwi, passion fruit, vanilla, melons, including cantaloupe and watermelon. Also somewhat dependent on bee pollination, coffee.
That's a big one, yeah.
That's a big one. Apples and pears, avocados, citrus fruits, coconuts, cherries.
Kind of what I'm hearing is that, contextualize this for the United States a little bit. So much of our food that we eat, just like on a day-to-day basis, in terms of produce and stuff, comes from the Central Valley of California, right?
That's right. That's right.
Not all of it, but I think most people will be surprised that, if you live in, wherever, New York, Texas, a lot of your produce is probably still coming from California.
It is probably one of the most, if not the most, agriculturally productive areas in the world.
Right. And kind of what I'm hearing is that a lot of, based on the crops you've just sort of run through, because I know California grows them all, is that we are very dependent on this singular bug species, insect species, for a lot of our food.
And the list goes on. Cherries, mangoes, onions. Apparently squash and pumpkins have the way that they're grown in the industrial setting are pretty dependent on bees. Many variety of berries, including blueberries, blackberries, raspberries. Cotton is another one. So people might not be thinking about that, but that's of course a major plant for developing fabrics that are turned into textiles and clothes. And so the bee has a pretty important role to play in the production of cotton.
Well, and I think most people aren't thinking about this within any of the contexts we're talking about right now, right? I think most people, and I would include myself. I'm not a bee expert. I'm not an insect expert. I'm not an agriculture expert. I'm not, I think about some things, but not this area specifically. I think most people probably don't realize that their food is dependent on bees, to a pretty high degree. They probably think like, oh, well, bees are nice. I like bees. They go around, they to all the flowers, and they make all the flowers, pollinate and then bloom, and then we get these really nice things inside our city. Where sort of what you're sort of listing out is like already, not to jump the gun to our what if scenarios, but like, we're in trouble. That's not good.
There's a lot of things that people are used to eating on a daily basis that are pollinated by bees. Absolutely. And it's not only that. Consider this, that in an industrial setting, cows are pretty dependent on plants pollinated by insects. So cows, a lot of them are fed alfalfa, for example, and this is a plant that's pollinated by bees. So the beef and dairy industries are industries that are also, to some degree, at least in the way they're operating in the United States, somewhat dependent on bees as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think and just to track back a little bit, because honestly, you're kind of blowing my mind. I knew this was going to be an interesting episode. I didn't know a lot of what you're telling me right now. And I think where my head is kind of going, and maybe you can level set me, or maybe just tell me, oh, you're right on the money, is that we've created all of these very elaborate agricultural systems to the point where it's basically, factory farming, right? Things are so honed in, so industrialized. It's basically a big old machine that moves, sort of, almonds, from little sapling all the way to the little bag of almonds in your store. And again, not knowing that bees were such a big part of this, I'm now like thinking like, okay, are bees? They're not just these wild creatures. They're more like kept in like captivity and like sort of unleashed. I guess how do people? I'm struggling with figuring out how people control the bees to make sure that they go to each of their, trees, their almond trees, and their big old orchard to ensure that all of their almond trees, produce almonds. And it's a wild concept because insects you don't think of as being something you can herd or really contain without sort of pesticides.
It's an interesting question because as I'm reading about and researching some of this stuff, I'm seeing a distinction in some of the literature between talking about bees as domesticated versus managed.
Right.
And that some would suggest that domestication is accurate, and some would say that that's sort of mischaracterization of the relationship between people and bees, and that they're more managed than anything, and that bees are seeking pollen. So if they're brought to a location where there are a lot of plants to pollinate, that they're going to go there and then they'll come back to these hives that have been created by people so that, honeycombs naturally we're used to seeing in these slats that exist within these hives that people create. But normally bees would be creating things that are not so square, right? They're sort of more amorphous, sort of organic shapes. What's interesting is that and particularly in, I'm going to say North America or in the United States, where the industrial agriculture is really developed into the major way in which most food is produced. There's a lot of food that's produced organically in other ways, but industrial agriculture is huge. And one of the things that happens, I don't know if you're aware of this, is that there is a practice of long distance trucking of bees for rent as pollinators, so that bees may be in Florida or something to pollinate a particular crop. And then the bees are put in their hives on 18-wheeler trucks and driven maybe to California to pollinate almond trees or something like that, and then brought to another part of the country, so that bees are being trucked throughout the country in the United States in order to pollinate. And we're going to get to some of the things that are threatening bee populations, but it's, many people have pointed to the fact that this is probably not good for bee populations for them to be managed in such a way. But that this is one of the ways in which industrial agriculture has harnessed the power of bees.
Right. I mean, as you were saying, as you were talking about trucking bees from Florida to California, my mind immediately went like, that has to be extremely stressful for the bees, like to a degree where I wouldn't be surprised if this does happen regularly. I would be more surprised if it doesn't. That during that process you're going to lose hives, right? There's just going to be a hive of bees that's just like, we're too stressed, and that's going to cause a collapse, and all that kind of stuff, right?
There are some academic studies that address this. When you read about this stuff in more popular literature, this is usually not cited as one of the top causes of bee collapses, but we'll get to that in a moment. Let me say a few other things about the things that bees pollinate, and then I'll talk about things that bees don't pollinate.
Okay, great. Let's do it.
So there's certain medications, like think about poppy plants, that are pollinated by bees, which are derived from various drugs, including morphine. So
Right.
morphine, which is used as a very powerful painkiller, would be harder to come by without bees. Aspirin apparently is a medication that at its root is derived from a plant that needs bees. You've heard of canola oil, probably, right? Maybe you
Oh yeah.
cook with
Hmm.
canola oil. Canola oil is a genetically modified form of rapeseed oil, which was developed in Canada in the 1970s. And so this form of vegetable oil is also very dependent on bee pollination. So, this is not an exhaustive list, but just to give listeners an idea of some of the things that might be an intimate part of their diet that bees are responsible for pollinating. Now, there are other things that bees are not involved in pollinating. Insects aren't involved in pollinating. A lot of times these are pollinated by wind, or in the case
Mm.
of tubers, they're ground pollinated or pollinated in different ways.
And a
So
tuber would be like a potato, just to be
yeah,
clear. Okay.
so potatoes, cassava, yams, sweet potatoes
All
are
right.
propagated by tubers,
Makes
not
sense.
pollinated by bees,
Yeah.
apparently. Again, I'm not an expert in these things. This is based on the research that I've done. So listeners may have some more information that I don't have, and that's entirely
There's always that
possible.
scientist, that bee scientist listening right now,
It's
being
like,
like,
this is
oh
all
boy. All
wrong.
right. Well,
Exactly. What are
about
these guys talking
50-50.
about? Exactly. But I think we can say with a fair degree of confidence that cereals are grasses which are grown for their grains. So that's the difference between a cereal and a grain. A cereal is a grass that's grown for the grains, and that's what people harvest in order to turn into food, into staple crops. The grains are the edible seeds of cereals or legumes. So rice, corn, and wheat, which are the major staple crops on the planet, do not require animal pollination. So that's something interesting to put on the table, that the three main crops that are grown throughout the world as staple crops do not require bee pollination.
So what are they? How so would that be like wind pollination?
Wind pollination. Yeah.
Interesting. Huh.
Yeah.
So it's just like, I guess, and you said wheat, right?
Wheat, rice, corn, apparently soybeans, onions, and leeks are other crops, other plants that we don't rely on for animal pollination or bee pollination.
So I guess for wheat, I'm just thinking about, like, there's a picturesque farm with, like, the wheat stalks or whatever they're called, wheat grass. Mm-hmm. And, it's just, field after field of it. And it's just like a wind blows along the one of the plain states that they're growing wheat in, and all of a sudden it just pollinates straight on through or something.
I guess that's the general idea. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned miles and miles of a particular crop, because monocropping is a very industrial form of agriculture where you're growing, you're radically changing ecosystems. So there's mostly one plant growing, the plant that people want to eat, and a weed would be anything that you don't want there, basically. And so that is part of what's driven this industry of honeybees being trucked around and kept in different places, so to pollinate these giant monocultures of foods. And of course, not in the case of the cereals and the grasses, but there's also giant groves of almonds and some of these other orchards which are expansive and these kinds of things, in which bees become very, very important.
Yeah, I frequently use a B-roll footage inside my videos of a gigantic almond orchard, and it just stretches on for miles and miles and miles and miles. And it's really quite impressive in its scale and its sameness, right? There's nothing else aside from maybe like a house or a farm silo every whatever mile or so.
But this form of agriculture generally demands an enormous amount of inputs in the form of pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, oftentimes. And so this scale of agriculture comes with its own challenges. And whenever there's a problem, usually increased technology is developed in order to address those problems. So this is, different from more traditional forms of agriculture, where plants are grown together because sometimes they bring benefits to one another. So one plant may attract something that would kill other insects,
Hmm.
or provide shade, provide a stalk for a vine to grow on, these kinds of things. And so this is a different form of farming than more traditional form of farming. It's usually called than industrial farming.
Right. And I've definitely heard of, farms that try and at least go back to some aspect of that, where it's not, this idea of just a single crop, right? They're trying to like mix them in so that they're getting benefits of, two or three different kinds of crops. I don't think it'll ever fully get back to the point where it's, I guess so multi, culture that it's basically almost like it was growing in the wild, right?
Well,
That's
we've become accustomed to growing things in massive quantities, and it's
right.
more challenging to do that. Apparently, I mean, maybe it's not. Maybe it could be done at this scale, but that's not the way that we've gone about doing things.
Right.
At
Because
least
I mean,
not in the United States. For the
yeah.
most part.
And to be fair, like, we have, 8 billion people to feed now, which we don't do a great job at in the first place. And so, I think there's questions of, and this is very close to spinning out into another conversation about the green revolution and everything. And I don't want to go too far into that, but I definitely think, there's just an argument to be had here that we need, to a degree, some of this factory farming in order to just feed the vast quantities of people that we have.
That's an argument that's been made, and it's when you hear 8 billion, it'd be tempting to think that that's automatically true. What the Green Revolution, again, we're spinning into it, but it's hard not to address just a little bit. That one of the things that the Green Revolution has done has promoted industrial agriculture, which has been a huge loss to many small scale farmers throughout the world.
Yeah.
And so that increasingly the large scale farms and the corporations that finance and support those are the ones that are reaping a lot of the benefits from agriculture and have a lot of control over what's grown and how it's grown. And so that's why there's a debate, because there are activists and scientists who are arguing something different, which is that it's not the only way to feed people industrial agriculture. And it doesn't have to be all or nothing is the other thing. It doesn't have to be only this method, that there are other methods that would afford more agency, more control to small scale farmers that we shouldn't necessarily dismiss away. There is an enormous amount of money and revenue involved in the industries that are related to bees. And so just a couple statistics, and it's hard to know how these statistics are arrived upon. But by one estimate, bees contribute over $15 billion annually to the US economy. And an Ohio State University study suggests over $500 billion globally. And so that there is a lot of money at stake in the way that agriculture is practiced right now. And particularly with the use of honeybees, there's a lot of momentum towards growing food in this particular way.
Is there a bee conglomerate? Like a company that just, be incorporated, because we, and the reason why I'm asking is because, and we talked about this in one of our other episodes about, I think, the chicken industry. And there's like 4 companies that like own the chicken, like Cargill and Tyson or something.
Right. That are
So,
responsible for an enormous amount of the production of I mean, it's an ugly way to say it, but the production of broilers, which are chickens, or different aspects, or food processing, or these kinds of things. I don't have that information for bees. That may or may not be the case. That's something that we could follow up on. But looking more specifically at the industry leaders and this kind of thing would be interesting. I think there's also small scale operations of individuals and smaller groups that are keeping bees as well. And of course, they're very small scale beekeeping operations as well, but I don't have a really good sense of that range. So that's something I can't speak to.
Yeah. And just to talk a little bit about the smaller scale operations, I definitely know, again, here in Portland, but I think this happens in a lot of cities. If you come across let's say on the side of your house, a beehive forms, right? Which isn't uncommon, right? It happens. There are people that you can just call. There's like usually a local bee organization is like, call us, and a beekeeper will come and like sort of take that hive away for
take that.
free.
It's a swarm, right? A swarm of
Swarm,
bees,
yeah.
right?
Like,
And wild bees apparently largely. I mean, there may be some that have that dynamic, but I think a lot of these swarms might be honeybees
mhm.
that then can be collected, and apparently it's a pretty fascinating process. But yeah, that's something that happens. But maybe we should turn our attention to some of the threats that bees have been experiencing, that leads us to our what ifs.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get to it. So, colony collapse. So that's a big word that we hear floated around. We're going to need.
Yeah, and I think that we want to make a distinction here. I think that is something that has been talked about. There's colony collapse disorder, which was a phenomenon that was discerned, and that term was coined in 2006, apparently. And this speaks to a particular phenomenon of bees. And this is information from the EPA, where colony collapse disorder is the phenomenon that occurs when a majority of worker bees in a colony disappear and leave behind a queen, leave behind plenty of food and a few nurse bees to care for the remaining immature bees and the queen. Now, this was particularly acute 2006-07 for several years and seems to have abated to some degree by 2015. Some of the information that I'm seeing suggests that there have been a pretty big decline in honeybees from 2020 to 2021. Whether that is colony collapse disorder or something else is a little bit unclear to me. So we were talking about colony collapse disorder, particularly in North America, but in other parts of the world as well, as this distinct concern.
Mm-hmm.
But what we can talk about are some of the things that are threats to bees that may have contributed to either colony collapse disorder or contributing to the decline in bees today, whether that should be considered CCD or not. The other thing I would say is that there are declines in honeybee populations, which is usually what's, I think, most often researched, but there's also declines in wild bee populations, which should be of concern as well. And sometimes these studies are focusing on honeybees, and other studies maybe are focusing on wild bees, but I think that is less researched. I think the honeybee is the most researched insect in the world, probably. And so a lot of because it's so important for pollination, receives a lot of attention for research.
Right. I think after everything you sort of already built up into this episode, yeah, I can see why there would be absolutely a lot of money funding. Okay, why are bees going away, or why are they dying? Why are they collapsing? Because would you say it was $500 billion globally industry? Yeah, there's a lot of concerned people out there who have a financially vested interest in keeping these populations alive, but then also governments who have a lot of other reasons to keep them around.
So there is a nonprofit organization I learned about called the BIP, the Bee Informed Partnership, which has started to track the loss of managed bees since 2006, since colony collapse disorder was identified as a problem. And I think apparently it's somewhat typical for 20% of a hive to fail or to not return from a winter to a spring. But that, for example, in 2020 to 2021, and again, it's hard to know exactly for me to know without going deep into the study where this information comes from, but there was a 45% loss of managed bees from this particular study. So there's a geography to this, which I think is hard for us to comment on right now because we're operating at this sort of higher level of information, by which I mean more generalized level of information.
Yeah.
And that the EPA sort of wants us to think about the idea that dead bees doesn't necessarily mean colony collapse disorder. But here's some of the threats to bees that we should be aware of. Pesticides.
Can I guess one?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to guess probably the big one, pesticides.
Pesticides it's usually number one on the list, right? And there's a particular category of pesticides, neonicotinoids, I believe is the pronunciation of this. And these are killing bees or compromising their foraging abilities. Sometimes this variety of pesticides is shrunk to the term neonics, and it's systemic pesticides which means that it gets into the plant and the pollen, the nectar, the leaves, the plant itself becomes toxic. And so this has been identified, and there's certain companies that would suggest that this is not a problem, but a lot of what I've seen suggests that this is a major problem. And part of what's responsible for the decline in bee populations are these pesticides. And they're harmful to other animals as well, species of birds, for example. It's also important to note that this particular category of pesticides is much more controlled in places like Canada and Europe, for example, than it is in the United States. And so the United States, this is still widely used, where some of these particular pesticides have actually been banned in places in Europe. And so that's where some of the geography of these issues comes into play as well.
Yeah. And I mean, so, going back to, whoever those companies are, and I legitimately don't know, but, arguing that, it doesn't actually have that impact, on bees or, what have you. I mean, how could it not, right? When you create these chemicals that are literally designed to kill a vast swath of insect, or I mean, obviously, they make pesticides for, mice and all this kind of stuff too. But just, it's poison, right? It's like, we call them pesticides, but what it is, it's poison. It's poisons that's targeted at a specific kind of creature. And even if it maybe doesn't directly impact the bee, right? Let's say they craft a pesticide that a bee is completely immune to. You could spray them all day and the bee's still just going to be around. The reverberating impacts of everything else that you're killing is going to have an impact on, and I think that's what always gets lost, especially when sort of these corporations are trying to talk about their impacts. Is like, well, okay, you're leaving out all of the interconnectedness of nature, which is has millions of years of evolution built into it, and you're talking about wiping out a core part of that, sort of a section of that.
So an ecosystem is impacted, and that could be an ecosystem that might be highly altered by people or slightly altered by people. As you're suggesting, that's going to have lots of different kinds of impacts.
Right. How could it not? It absolutely has some impact.
Other things that contribute to the decline in bees include the spread of mites, parasitic mites that are attacking bees. There's habitat loss. That's another big one. So by habitat loss, I mean human alterations to the natural environment. Urbanization probably comes to people's minds, but probably the biggest human alteration to the planet has been agriculture itself. Mm-hmm. And so the loss, the promotion of monocultures, the promotion of particular forms of agriculture has also amounted to the loss of lots of wildflowers, which are particularly important to wild species of bees. And so habitat loss combined with pesticides, parasitic mites, disease, climate change, sometimes poor management practices have also been identified. And maybe that relates back to the trucking of bees, that the suite of these issues together has not been good for bee populations.
Yeah. And I think going back to habitat loss, again, that makes me think of, I mean, obviously there's a large part of the world. I think the one that's probably most often thought of today would be the Brazilian rainforest, which, obviously there's a lot of habitat loss happening there as ranchers and sort of agriculture wants to take over more land in order to, do whatever. But that's coming at the cost of the rainforest, which is an incredibly rich, diverse sort of ecosystem. And you just can't pop up, bees somewhere else and they can just sort of continue on as if nothing changed, right?
And ecosystems throughout the world, whether it's, a rainforest or not, are highly altered, highly impacted by human activity. And, we're learning that this is having an impact on pollinators, on bees, and that has a direct impact on our food supply.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's almost time for another ad.
Let's the dramatic pause before the what ifs. That's right.
All right. Dramatic pause. We're going to list some ads and then we're going to dive into our what ifs. So here we go. And we're back talking more about bees, and we are about to jump into some of our what if scenarios. So Hunter, let's kick it off.
Well, as we've been talking about, because so many plants are dependent on bees for pollination, that some plants would go extinct without bees. We just wouldn't have certain plants. Some of them are food crops and some of them are not. And then certain animals that birds, for example. There's species of birds that feed on insects, and bees included, and some of these animals would go extinct. So that would have this impact on different aspects of the natural environment where certain plants and animals wouldn't be able to survive without bees.
Right. And I'm thinking, going back to, I think you had mentioned that almond trees, for example, are entirely bee pollinated. And so obviously if there weren't bees, we can probably kiss almonds goodbye.
That seems to be what I've read, and we'll get to a couple other scenarios here that might provide an alternate way of pollination when we get to we'll save that for the end of the
Interesting.
In a few minutes.
Yeah.
But
mechanical bees.
But that kind of thing has been proposed. But yeah, the almond industry would likely have difficulty surviving. And even let's say that almond trees didn't go extinct altogether, maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't, the availability of almonds would be greatly changed. And so, to go back to the fake Einstein quote, would people disappear from the planet 4 years after the disappearance of bees? Probably not.
Right.
However, although people probably wouldn't go extinct, many human diets would change significantly. And it would very possibly lead to a good deal of malnutrition in different parts of the world. A lot of vitamins and minerals that we get from some of these crops that are pollinated by bees would be much harder to come by. There'd probably be a far less variety of food in many diets. And there would probably be the increase in the cost of a lot of food, probably a huge increase. And so even if some of these crops, some of these plants, some of these food items didn't disappear entirely, their cost would be prohibitive for a lot of people. So that would change the way that agriculture is practiced. That would change the way that people eat. That would change the economies of food. And so that would cause a major disruption in human life, even if it didn't lead to the extinction of people.
Yeah. And I think so. I think a lot of people often sort of, say, oh, well, if X or Y happens, humans will go extinct. And I often push back against that idea because I think people don't realize just how resilient of a species humanity is. Humans have survived a lot. They've survived a lot of sort of extinction level events, dating, decades or thousands of years ago. I don't think there would be suffering, certainly by the loss of bees. Like you pointed out, a lot of, nutrition lost, a lot of, expensive food going up. People would certainly probably, perish. There probably wouldn't be as many humans.
And that's a really important point to make, is that who would suffer, right?
Exactly.
And the people who would suffer are the people who are already the most economically challenged, the most disenfranchised from power, the poorest people in the world would be a lot of the people who would bear the brunt of this kind of situation. So there is, there is some politics to this situation.
There's an economic geography to it. And it makes me think of the grain that's grown in Peru, I think, quinoa.
Yep.
And even, this is sort of a little bit of a tangent, but this is a grain that historically had been eaten by Peruvians. I think it is Peru. Eaten by Peruvians, grown by Peruvians, and then all of a sudden, Western, more sort of United States, European countries, Canadian, grew interested in this because it's a quote unquote super grain. It's very healthy, very nutritious, and then all of a sudden the price skyrockets for quinoa, and all of a sudden now Peruvians can't eat their own, crops that they grow because it's too expensive.
I mean, there's probably a similar story with corn itself, right? Which is a grass that is from Mesoamerica, which is completely essential to the nutrition and the culture and the economy of peoples for millennia in this area. It is now one of the most widely grown crops in the world. And, also not only the cost, but the biologic diversity of corn has been challenged as well. And so, again, we're getting off things that are not pollinated by bees, but there might be some kind of knock-on effect where, of course, these staple crops become even more important, perhaps,
right,
because a lot of other foods aren't available. there would be all kinds of shifts in agriculture, I would imagine, right? The cotton industry is another thing we mentioned before that would have to completely transform. And, a lot of the clothes I'm wearing at this very moment are largely cotton. And
Same.
so that would have a huge impact on our ability to provide for ourselves one of the other essential aspects of life, which is, clothing, so that we can stay warm. And
which probably means, if there's no cotton, which is not like, obviously that's an industry that, it has its own sort of damaging effects. But I think without cotton, then I think a lot of the clothes that we wear go even more into sort of the artificial threads and everything that are just sort of like plastic based, which is oil based, which has again this knock on effect of, okay, now there's more microplastics floating around because these things get washed.
All of a sudden there's a resurgence in wool and the sheep ranges expand, and the issues associated with that, right? Yeah. So would we see more sheep ranges if the cotton was no longer as viable? And there's all kinds of sort of interesting, windy kind of scenarios that the disappearance of bees would lead us to thinking about. Another thing that I want to raise, which is, let's tweak the question here that it's honeybee populations that collapsed. Right?
Okay.
So that there's still more varieties of wild bees, more species of wild bees. Maybe all of a sudden people become interested in supporting populations of native bees in different ways. So, for example, I give you an example from North America. There's a bee called the blue orchard bee, which is native to North America. They don't live in hives. They don't make honey, but they're very good at pollinating fruit trees. And they're one of the few wild species of bees that are managed in agriculture in the United States. So if it was the honeybee specifically populations that collapsed, would attention turn towards some of these wild species of bees in an effort to try to promote the existence or the proliferation of some of these wild species in order to pollinate things? It's a possibility.
Is there any research out there that sort of dives into, or maybe like just shows that, okay, there's an issue with colony collapse, or or basically bees dying that are just of this honeybee variety, whereas wild bees are actually doing okay relative?
No, I actually think it's the reverse, that native wild populations of bees are actually probably suffering more than honeybees are.
Right.
And a lot of it has to do with the habitat loss that we talked about before, monocropping and these kinds of things, where agriculture isn't set up to promote the kinds of plants that these bees might pollinate, or some of the plants they might pollinate that people aren't eating or something like that. So based on what I've read, it seems that wild bee populations are at least threatened as much as honeybee populations, if not more, in many parts of the world. And of course, there's a geography to this, which I can't speak to everywhere in the world. But I think that there's a big concern with wild bee populations as well.
Okay. So then maybe that sort of what if scenario, maybe could happen, right? But I guess where I was trying to get at was like, okay, like, is there this, wild population of bees that we can actually rely on in that scenario?
Maybe not at the scale of agriculture that honeybees have been expected to deliver to people. Mm-hmm. So, but there could, it would take it's hard to say a return to, because things have changed so much, but an attentiveness to the kinds of environments and ecosystems which would allow native bee populations to thrive. There would have to be attention to that for more wild bee species to be successful pollinators for crops for people. Another thing is that bees are used in lots of different scientific research, and I'll give you one example. That bees apparently are used for researching diseases, including Alzheimer's disease. And so there are certain lines of research that they're using bees for. And again, there's ethics involved in this, which we could debate on another day. Mm-hmm. But that certain research that people are conducting in order to try to alleviate diseases that affect people might be compromised as well by a collapse or disappearance of bees also.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know. And I'm assuming it must have something to do with sort of like how a hive sort of mind sort of reacts because, right, it's I can see the connections between sort of a brain disease and sort of a hive disease, right? As one starts to degrade, like the entire sort of hive sort of degrades.
I'm not sure what the links are, but
Yeah, but so
yeah.
fascinating. Yeah. Like these are just like there's so many like unintended consequences. We often jump to these big obvious ones. Well, yeah, obviously X would happen if Y ceased to exist. But then we neglect that. Well, there's all these like things that are inside the background that might even have longer term, bigger impacts, right? Because we can replace, and at some degree, we can replace sources of food. Or if we go to the cotton, we can replace that, to some degree. But can we replace valuable research to lead to a cure for a disease that impacts millions of people? I don't know, but I think it's interesting.
That's a big what if, right? Well, and then I think one of the last things we can consider here is this: is if the bee colonies or bee populations were to collapse or were to disappear, again, it doesn't have to be colony collapse disorder. If all these other things, pesticides and habitat loss, have decimated bee populations, then we would probably have to people would have to rethink the way that pollination happened in the first place. And this has happened in some areas. Now, somewhat famously, I think, there is certain places in China, in Sichuan province in particular, where apple and pear orchards for a few decades now have been hand pollinated by people.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
So because of intense habitat loss and intensive pesticide use that has led to a significant enough decline in bees in certain areas, that apple and pear orchards are pollinated by individuals who have a little brush and are having to climb trees and pollinate individual flowers. And this is very labor intensive and would be very hard to replicate the speed at which bees can do this. And there's also, in a lot of species of plants, a narrow window in which pollination can even occur. And so even if hand pollination by people were to be adopted, it might not be able to replace the scale of agriculture that people have become used to.
This is where we maybe start thinking about bee drones, and not like drones as in like this is like little like robots.
Right. Well, I mean, the little mini helicopters, drones, I mean, they're probably taken from the language that we used to talk about bees, the drones that we mentioned before. But it's funny you should ask that, because there has been some experimentation, and this is not anything that's been used on any kind of even small scale, certainly not commercial scale. But there's been at least one researcher who in Japan is using very small drones to try to pollinate plants.
Interesting.
And what's been discovered is that it's one of the things that's so difficult about this is that the drones with their tiny little wings are causing damage to a lot of the plants. And this makes it very challenging for a drone to be used in order to pollinate plants. So apparently, and one of the same researchers, I think, from Japan, was out with his son and they were blowing bubbles, right, for fun. And this scientist saw the wind catch some of these bubbles and spread the bubbles really far afield, and how thinking, well, wait a minute, is there a way that pollen can be inserted into some kind of soap and bubbles made and bubbles be used for pollination? So that is an experiment that's happening, apparently ongoing experiment right now. And so the idea has been to develop just the right soap that would be able to carry pollen. And there are some issues with this. Apparently that's in a very limited trial. There's been some success, but the success has been at the rate of hand pollination by people. 95% or something like that. That there is a lot of waste generated from this. For generating the soaps, there's a lot of byproduct waste. There's also low effectiveness when it's rainy or when it's windy, and that's hard to control, of course. Yeah. And that bubble solution may possibly be doing damage to some plants or some insects, including some pollinators. However, some early tests show that this is something that they're going to maybe try to keep experimenting with. And then, so to go back to the drone for just a moment, there have been some other tests that have been done, again, really basic experimental stuff, where a drone is hovering around and is actually blowing the bubbles around.
Oh, they're merging the two. The two
merging the
technologies
two
come together.
That's right. So again, I don't want to suggest that this is something that's about to come onto the agricultural market and transform the way that pollination happens, but there's research being done. Right. And so you would imagine that if bee populations would become even more threatened and would start to disappear, that there'd be an enormous amount of research and development and money put into research and development for developing alternative modes of pollination.
It kind of makes me think of, and this is, I mean, I say this all the time, this is definitely a future episode, but it kind of makes me think of nanotechnology, which, Hunter, if you're not familiar with, it's, incredibly, very, very, very small, let's say robots, drones, whatever, to the point where, it's almost like a liquid, right? If you get a bunch of them together, it's like, a liquid of sort of robots. To the point where, like, okay, like, if that magical technology existed, maybe, a drone can go anywhere and do whatever because it's so small and it can do its thing and not damage anything in theory, right? But I think, like, maybe this is like when we're talking about drones that, potentially small enough, like, I think it starts getting down to that. Okay, how small can we really make effective mechanics work? And I don't think we're there yet, obviously.
Yeah, I think that this is pretty far away from being recognized, from being realized in any kind of viable way for growing lots of food. Mm-hmm. But it's just interesting to note, as we sort of start to wrap it up here, that research is being conducted, and in some places in the world, hand pollination is being exercised. And in other words, there's some places that have already experienced this level of decline in bees where they've had to start to adopt alternative methods of pollination.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, so are we about wrapped up? So wait. No, wait. So I have one topic that I get to talk about.
Okay.
So I guess some backstory. Hunter told me he was going to do an episode about bees. And my only request was that I wanted to talk about the murder hornet for a few minutes. Just because when we're not going to have another episode about bees in a while. So
maybe eventually.
Well, and I think, it's not a primary cause of bee collapse, but I think it's gotten a lot of headlines over the last couple of years, particularly in the US. So for those that don't know, I think it's called the giant Asian hornet, which is derived from Japan, I believe, is a really large, basically wasp. And these suckers are huge. They're, if you hold up your thumb, they're about that size. And they had made their way into British Columbia. I want to say maybe like starting, 5 years ago, maybe up to a decade. And then in 2020, when everything else was going on, we suddenly started seeing headlines also of like Washington states, starting to have, the quote unquote murder hornets. And the reason why they're called murder hornets is because they can be deadly to humans, but that's not why they're called murder hornets. The reason why is because they will basically go and find a honeybee hive, and the honeybee hive could have thousands of bees, and 5 of these hornets can basically destroy that entire hive and kill all the bees, and basically just wreak havoc, right? They are incredibly destructive to our, well, I guess maybe our not so local honeybee population that I may have originally thought were our local honeybees. But I think just the point goes is that the murder hornets got a lot of press, and I think a lot of people were starting to talk about them within this sort of sphere of, like, oh, well, yeah, honeybees, bees are dying, all this kind of stuff. And now we have this whole new bug that's also killing bees by the score, or destroying hives by the score. And I think, it's been a little exaggerated. It's definitely been sort of interesting. It's an interesting topic.
It's something that could develop into a bigger problem. So at the moment, I think if you were to talk to bee researchers, it's probably not the top of their list of concerns for bee populations. However, that could change. And as you're suggesting, there's anecdotal evidence at least to suggest that these insects can decimate hives of bees. and can kill people. Also, I mean, it's a venom that's delivered to people, and a series of stings from these animals can be fatal, apparently.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, they're dangerous.
I feel like my entire life I've heard about killer bees, and so it's hard to know when to take that as something that's going to be a phenomenon that's really going to change things a lot. But it's certainly an alarming thing that gets people to, I guess, in the past, buy a newspaper and click in the contemporary day.
Exactly.
But it's hard to know exactly how big an issue that's going to be.
Yeah. Well, and just we can sort of end on, I guess, a little bit of good news here is that this year, so Washington State, which has largely been the state that's been impacted, obviously British Columbia is still impacted, but they've been going out and leaving traps and capturing them and then putting a tracker on the hornet and taking back the nest and destroying the nest. And so this is the first year that they have not been able to trap any, which means they are pretty confident that the current sort of quote unquote murder hornets, whatever, infestation is under control, which is great. So it's really good news.
Well, we can always revisit this on a future episode about invasive species or something.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, in that case, I guess let's go ahead and just shoot some pluggables and wrap it up.
I'm Hunter Shobe, professor of geography at Portland State University, author of Portlandness, a cultural atlas, and Upper Left Cities, an atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. I enjoyed this topic today.
Yeah, and my
as scary as it is, I think it's important to talk.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. No, it's definitely a scary topic. My name is Jeff Gibson. I am the co-host of this podcast, and I run a YouTube channel called Geography by Jeff. And you can also find me on Substack by the same name. So it's just geographybyjeff.substack.com. I just do geography things here and there, and we're just geography nerds. But find me elsewhere on the internet or just listen to this podcast. I'm just happy that you were able to join us today.
Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening. Goodbye.